Okay. Does everyone see my presentation now? Okay, great. Sounds good. Okay, great. So, okay, and that's gonna keep an eye on chat. So use chat as a way to interrupt if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, also just feel free to shout out. This is the first time we're using Google Hangouts as opposed to Zoom, so we'll see how the interactivity works. In the meantime, okay, so we're going to talk about Open edX authentication. That was requested by the community, so I spent a little bit of time to prepare this. As you'll see, though, it's not completely fleshed out, so I am basically relying on people to stop me and ask questions if something is not clear. Otherwise, I've tried my best to sort of just give both the background as well as our current thoughts. So first of all, Open edX, we have adopted OAuth 2.0 as our standard for, authentication and also in some ways authorization. And OAuth, the standard itself, right, is meant to be an authorization framework to basically figure out which applications should have access to certain resources. And but anyway, many people and even Open edX, we're doubling up the standard for both identity as well as access management. And so I'm going to just step through what I mean by that. There's a link to the RFC as well, so people can refer to and reference it. So, yep. Was somebody wanting to say something? Okay, so moving on. So essentially what it all boils down to is we have a client that wants to make an API call to a resource server. So we have a client and a resource server, a server that is holding resources. And that API could be a REST API, right? Or it could be any sort of call that needs to be made. What are the types of clients we're talking about? Well, we have web applications, mobile applications, but it could also be just another server that wants to talk to this resource server and get data from it or make calls to it. That server may be making calls on behalf of a user, or it just might be a backend process that wants to connect to another resource server. So, but in OAuth speak and whatnot, we just say client there as a means of saying it's a client that wants to make an API call. And now with OAuth, what it specifies is, allows us to provide an access token that we then embed in an HTTP authorization header. That access token is basically a summative way of presenting to the resource server that, hey, I've got an approval to connect to you, and this access token summarizes, what that approval is. That's an access token that I may have gotten from an authorization server or through other means. And with OAuth, this end result of just making an API call from client to resource server is essentially what we want to get at. Now, OAuth and the standard and even our implementation, the reason why people get confused, I believe, is just that there's many different use cases that then allow us to get to that endpoint. All these different use cases could be then explained, or they result in different grant types, what OAuth calls different grant types. So you have single sign-on as one use case where you might have an external service that wants to be an identity provider. So for instance, Google, LinkedIn, these are different external services that, we want to use as a single place where we can, they authenticate the user, they then claim what the identity of that user is. And there's a library that we use in Open edX called third-party auth that allows us to do that. Another means for single sign-on is when we use Open edX, or in our case today, right now, that's all embedded in the LMS, but Open edX essentially as an identity provider. And that is for all of our applications that are running in Open edX. By that, I mean like microservices or, microservices meaning, let's say, insights, e-commerce site, credential service, all of those things. Or it could also be external services outside of the Open edX instance that also want to use that Open edX instance as an identity provider. in my mind, I'm putting all of that into single sign-on as a capability, a use case that we may want to support. And then supporting front-end apps, as we mentioned earlier, web apps, mobile apps. One is a server they could be making that user might be as a blocking call. So while the user is making backend service call to get additional data and so forth. Or it could be just on behalf of itself, it's doing some background work and it's making a server to server call. Now these are all different use cases. And OAuth is a means for us to support these different use cases. And it does that via these different grant types that it supports. So essentially for single sign-on, the authorization code grant type is it allows us to support single sign-on. And we'll go a little bit into that flow and what that is. The authorization code grant type, it's really for a single user that you are making this request, and you need to then go get the right access token for that user so that you can then make calls on behalf of that user. You can do that via single sign-on is supported through that, as well as, yeah, that's essentially it. There are other means of supporting single sign-on, right? So for instance, people could use other protocols. It doesn't have to be OAuth, and we do support that, I think, right now with third-party auth, where, whether it's Shibboleth or other types of protocols there. But the focus of this talk is really on OAuth and where all the means by which we're supporting that. Now, the other grant types that are on this slide right now is a resource owner password credentials. That's the one that the mobile app uses. That one is reserved for really trusted clients. So it's not common that you would want to use that grant type very often, especially because that app that's using that grant type needs to get the learner's or the user's password. And we really want to minimize where passwords are accessed and exchanged and all that stuff. But currently that is what our mobile apps are using. And so we are trusting the mobile apps to get that data and then forward it in the protocol. And the last one that you see in the slide is called client credentials grant type. And we're going to go into that as well. And once again, that's for server-to-server calls and when a backend service is trying to connect to another service and it's making a call on behalf of itself. So any questions on that so far? Okay. Okay, cool. So one caveat to this is that one thing that we do want to make a change going forward is that for these web apps, instead of using authorization code grant type, we prefer that we want to migrate to using HTTP JOT cookies, JSON Web Token cookies. So anyway, just keep that in the back of your mind. I'll explain what I mean by that in the future slides as we go through this. And as you'll see, authorization code grant type has a lot of back and forth, and it's also does not meet where we want to be right with our future direction for web apps. So, okay, so this is the client credentials grant type. It's probably one of the simplest ones to just go over. But here you'll notice that there's a client, right, that wants to make that API call. And here, instead of the resource server, right, it needs to actually first go to the authorization server so that it can get back an access token. And essentially what it does is it calls this endpoint, OAuth2 access token. It says, hey, I'm using the client credentials grant type. Here's my client ID, here's my client secret. Client ID and client secret were exchanged out of band between the client and the authorization server. This grant type is reserved also for trusted clients, right? The client needs to be, it has to be a backend service. It has to be able to store that client secret in a secure way so that no one can get access to it. And then as you can see, whenever it wants to get a new access token, it needs to pass that client secret around to the authorization server. So, but it is a very simple, just back and forth. We already exchanged the client ID and client secret out of band. And now whenever I need an access token, I make this call, and then the authorization server will return this access token plus some additional information about the expiration and stuff like that. So that's the simplest one. And after it makes that call, then as before, it can just, that client then could take that access token that it got received and then make a call to the resource server. Here on the bottom, I have an example of like the curl statement that you would make, right, to just include that access token in the authorization header when you're making that API call. Okay, so no questions on that. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So the authorization code grant type, this image I just got from the RFC. And as you can see, there's a lot of back and forth here. So let me just step through this one step at a time. Essentially, the resource owner here, is most likely going to be the end user. So the RFC calls it an end user when it's a human that's involved here. And it is typically the use case that for which this grant type is used. Then this user agent is essentially like that end user's browser or whatever application, like front-end application that it's using to do things on its behalf. So here, right, the resource owner basically uses its browser. It goes through this authorization server to get to, so that via this user agent, via the browser, it authenticates to this authorization server. An authorization server could be Google, it could be LinkedIn, it could be the user service in edX, right? There's one place where that has like the user information and login information and all that stuff. But in the end, then at that time is when the authorization server authenticates the user and then provides a temporary authorization code that can be used just for this handshake. The user agent then provides that temporary authorization code to the client, and the authorization code then is presented to the authorization server saying, hey, look, I knew that this handshake happened earlier. I'm a client, and I didn't want access to the user's password or anything about authenticating the user, but I have this temporary code to prove that this authentication handshake just happened very recently. And so here, I'm presenting it to you. Now, please give me the access token that I can then use now on behalf of that user. So that's step D, right, where the client is presenting this temporary access code, and then step E is where the authorization server finally returns the access token to that client. As you'll notice here, the step B here, where user authenticates, it's only the end user here, the resource owner, then the browser, the user agent, and the authorization server. So those were the only three entities here that really needed to know about the user's credentials. Beyond that, the client and then the resource server never gets the user's credentials, right? So in this earlier handshake for this particular use case, all of this flow happens, and then in the end, what are we getting at? We're clients trying to make an API call. So once again, we go back to this, where the client now, given a access token, can make API calls to any resource servers on behalf of that end user that went through that authentication. And that's the authorization code grant type, right? And as you can, as that's very different from this client credentials grant type, right? So once again, OAuth 2.0 supports these different grant types. As you can see, the use case is very different, but in the end, they all come back to being able to make an API call with that access token. So any questions on that before we move on?
We're talking about that.
Okay. Are people
it's just
following?
Julio
okay.
and Jayam are
deep
into how to make Hangouts better.
Okay, fine.
Yep, following. I'm just, the thing I will hold, I'll shut up now and wait.
Okay, that sounds good. So then the other thing that's in the OAuth protocol is about token types. And the protocol, the RFC itself is agnostic to which token type you use. That token type I'm talking about bearer is, a lot more common, but JSON Web Token is where we want to go to. So the OAuth bearer token type, right? There's a link to the RFC there specifically for that bearer one. But essentially that access token, so that token type for bearer one will result in an access token, which is just a random string. It's just a random value. The disadvantage to that, though, is that then if you want to really validate to make sure that access token is still valid, like no one has gone and invalidated it, or to really make sure that that is a accurate access token, then you need to make a database call in the user service to make sure that it's still valid and can be used. The other disadvantage to that is then therefore it doesn't support microservices, right? Where we want independent microservices so that they receive a token, they don't want to go ahead and make a call to the LMS, to the user service each time for each API call that they get. So that's the disadvantage with like a vanilla bearer token type that's just a random string. So one way to alleviate that is to use OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is, we use that as an extension to our OAuth protocol a while back, and that's still in our system right now. But we're moving away from it, which I'll get to why. But that has a standard for this thing called an ID token, and that is signed, and so you can use that as an additional value that gets returned when the access token is returned. So after that handshake, you get an access token plus an ID token as an additional thing from the authorization server that then you can forward to all your resource servers. So, but the disadvantage of OpenID is that, I mean, it's a very large standard. It comes with a lot of complexity, which doesn't really serve it doesn't serve all the needs that we really have. So we actually prefer to move away from that. And it's also not supported by our latest authentication library, the Django OAuth toolkit that we're moving towards. So we prefer to actually use this other one, this JOT token type. So JOT, just pronounced as JOT, J-O-T. It's a JSON web token. And essentially, any claims related to identity and access, those can all be encoded in JSON. So it's a lot more flexible, and it can be signed with a JSON web signature. So basically there's standards for the JOT itself, and then for JOS, which is its web signature. And then there's also standards for the keys that are used in it. So that's a JOC, and each JOC can be identified with a key ID. And you can create a JOC set, which allows you to have multiple keys. So there's a lot, in terms of security, like this has a lot of good support. And because the JOC supports symmetric keys, asymmetric keys, right? So public, private keys, as well as a shared secret and all that stuff. So there's a lot of possibilities there. We would like to use asymmetric key pairs. And the reason is because we don't want to have a shared key that all authorization servers and resource servers need to know about. So that, there's only one public, there's only the authorization server knows a private key, and all the resource servers only know the public key, so that any resource server cannot just spoof and pretend to be the authorization server and create its own JOT that others can use. So anyway, there's a lot stronger security story there. And then in terms of the JOC and the JOC set, it allows for key rotation. It supports key rotation a lot better because you are able to now identify different keys, and you can have multiple keys at the same time, and things like that. So when we need to every so often, good security best practices to generate a new key and use it. It all works much better with this. Final note here is that we don't encrypt. We don't use, JOT does allow standard-wise, you could encrypt the payload if you choose to, but we don't encrypt that because we actually want to allow our resource servers to access the information in the payload. So if you want only the authorization server to know about the contents of a JOT, you could encrypt it, but then not share the keys with the resource server, things like that. But anyway, so that's not something that we do, but there's support for if we ever choose to do that in the future. So any questions on that? Going in the future, right, when we're talking about where we want to head, this is where we like to go. And essentially what it is, what I'm trying to show here, so let's just take this step by step as well. So, you have we have micro front ends, right? Essentially, these are independently deployed front ends or separated from your backend services. And so login would also have a micro front end, like a different front end that's separated out from the user service. But the thing is, what we'd love to happen, and we've started along this path in this direction, is that when a user goes to a micro front end, and if they're not logged in, then the micro front end will redirect them to the login micro front end. And then the login micro front end is the only one that really needs to access the user's credentials, whether it's via single sign-on with Google, or it's like, what's your Open edX password and username, all of that stuff is just all consolidated in here. So other front ends don't need to have their own UI implementations or any of that. And then the login will go ahead, and that is where we want to move towards. And so what the top half is what we have currently invested time in changing and making happen. So to dive a little bit deeper on what that involves, there is essentially, as I said, there's a single point for login and logout via the user service. Today, that's in the LMS. Eventually, user service should be moved out, but that's where it is today. Implementation detail is that we actually have that JOT cookie broken up into two parts. So the header and payload of the JOT, that's in a separate cookie, because that we do want to make available to JavaScript and the micro front-end code, because that allows them to know, okay, what is this user's username if they want to show that, or other identity information and things like that. What's the role of the user? Like those all things would be in there. And then another cookie is where we actually put the signature, and that we keep as HTTP only. And the reason for this is that we want to prevent the front end code, if there's any security attacks or whatever, like JavaScript code is never then able to get the entire JOT cookie. However, then what happens is that the front end code could still make calls to our Open edX backend services, and then we have middleware that we put in each of our backend microservices that would automatically recombine those cookies and create that JOT, so that it can then use that JOT for authentication and or authorization for specific endpoints in that service. Other tidbits, which might or might not be, I don't know if you guys are interested or not, but these JOTs would be short-lived. And we want to make sure that the expiration of those JOTs, right, that are inside HTTP cookies are consistent with expiration of any other HTTP cookies we have. Otherwise, it causes confusion if we have other cookies that we also gave you at login time, and we want the user's cookies to expire at the same time. And because they're also short-lived, we have to make sure that we have a way for front-end applications and others that are using these cookies to be able to refresh and get a new JOT when the old JOT is expired. Actually, I just realized I think I have to update the slide because it's not just two JOT cookies. There is another third cookie, which is actually your refresh cookie with another cookie that contains your refresh token. So Yeah. So that's JOT cookies. And this is my final slide. And then I'll open it up for questions. So where are we today and what do we need to do to get to that vision that we have? Just a couple of things here. So I say just a couple, but it's actually because of legacy, takes time to get there. But like Django OAuth provider is an old implementation of our authentication libraries. And we want to actually move to Django OAuth Toolkit. So a lot of this work that we've done and a lot of the ways we've created authentication, they're all supported by DOT. Not all of them are necessarily in DOPE. So DOPE is our name for Django OAuth provider, and DOT is where we want to get to. But DOPE is no longer supported by the community. So we actually have a fork that we're running off of right now, but we'd actually love to get out of that and just go ahead and use DOT. So where we have a shared library with the community. And also there are some features like being able to refresh tokens that aren't there in DOPE, but are only in DOT. And DOT also is implemented nicely with capabilities for us to extend and make changes to certain classes. So the other thing that we need to do is migrate away from bearer token type to just use JOT token type. As I said, there's security reasons for this, and definitely just more simpler way of doing identity and access propagation throughout our microservices. And the other thing is, unfortunately, we do have symmetric JSON web signatures right now on our JOTs. So we need to migrate that for security reasons to use asymmetric ones. So that's an implementation thing that will also need to happen. But all of these could be done independently from each other. And the last one is the one what I just talked about, which is starting to use HTTP JOT cookies. And like I said, we're already making changes in our front-end code to start using that. Yeah, and I think so that's all I had in terms of authentication. I wanted to open it up. Yeah, sounds good.
So first question from Julio, when is the switch from bearer to JOT going to happen?
Yeah.
And maybe this is combined with it, which is how short-lived for JOT cookies, JOT tokens?
Right. So, okay, so the short-lived one is, I have to check, but I think it's on the order of like an hour or something. So, but I need to, it's not days or weeks. So in the past, we would, I think our default was 2 weeks, for instance, for login. But this is configurable, right? So there is a Django setting for this. So for each OpenEdX instance, if you have different requirements, then you could, set that differently. This is something that we just implemented, I'd say maybe like 2 months ago or so, where, we're still, we're in the state where we're trying to figure out micro front ends. And micro front ends right now aren't like fully supported in OpenEdX, I will say. I think we're trying to get that more supported in Juniper, but for Ironwood and Hawthorne, like they're very early stages. So as we work things out, what we're doing is we are creating this these decision records in our OAuth dispatch right now.
So the switch is in Ironwood, Julio asked?
The switch from, so your question about switch from bearer token to JOT token type, there's a team right now that's currently under investigation of what is there in our system. We have not gotten a chance to fully document what we have everywhere. So I don't have a good answer for you in terms of like when it's finally gonna be removed. However, I will say that we will be using the DEPR process to communicate out if we are going to be making changes to certain implementations that we think would affect other OpenEdX instances. So we have already started using JOT token type for certain communications between microservices. So for instance, credential service uses JOT to communicate to discovery service to get catalog information. Now, these services I'm talking about, are they in use by your OpenEdX instance? I don't know, because it's not a requirement that all OpenEdX instances use that. So it really comes more into play if you are using more of our backend services. Eventually, right, our vision is that we'd love for all OpenEdX instances to also start using the different microservices that we are using here. So, okay. Okay, let me see, any other questions?
Namisha, is there a exemplary implementation that you would recommend now or in the future?
For which part?
I guess a micro front end. I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking for, but
yeah, right. So if I look at this diagram, you guys able to see my diagram? Yeah. So there is exemplary. So for the OpenX conference, we are going to have a tutorial session on Tuesday about creating your own micro front end. And so by then we do hope to have a lot more in terms of, good best practices and some sort of documentation that you can use. But I will say that we have a cookie cutter for micro front end apps. Mike, do you remember the name of that cookie cutter? I forget, but it's like React front end cookie cutter app or something like that. But in any way, it will come out of the box. The ability for you, I mean, it has a code because it uses this other library that we have, like I think it's called front end auth, that basically does all of this. So, all of this, by that I mean like being able to redirect to the login page, and it does the automatically refreshing tokens if it's expired. So we have a common library for that because we did not want each engineer to re-implement any of that. So this cookie cutter app depends on this other library for doing front-end auth, and the front-end auth library then will automatically make use of that. There may be some configuration settings, and that's where I'm saying that we might need to just put some documentation, right? If there's any configuration settings and stuff, like for instance, what is the URL path, right, for your OpenEdX instance, for your login service, right? That type of thing. So those types of things you might need to configure, but other than that, code-wise, it should be ready out of the box for that. And then in terms of a good exemplar for like an external API client, I do hope to have something better, a better story for that. Right now, we haven't yet focused our effort too much on that, but there are some teams that are, for instance, integrating with proctoring, external proctoring service providers and things like that, where they have needed to start looking into that. But if one of those deliverables from that team would be an exemplar and good documentation of how one can do that, that's something that I'd love to make sure that happens at some point. So Peter, is this the presentation and the content that you were expecting and looking for? Was this different? Was this less, more?
I think it's pretty close to what I was looking for. I think the gap I'm trying to leap right now is relating this to different points of API integration that we have implemented in the past, and sort of map this stuff to that other stuff. I don't think I'm quite there yet, but this will help a lot.
Okay, that sounds good. So, and in that regard, I mean, are you more in the external API client boat?
I think so.
Okay.
And I need to go back and look at the some of the configuration stuff at the very beginning, like trying to remember the right vocabulary here.
So client credential
grant type. There we go.
Yeah. So and there, right, as an external client, you could either be using this, right, if you're trying to do access any of our APIs that are more server-to-server related. If you are making calls on behalf of a user, on the other hand, right, then you most likely be in this boat.
Yeah.
And so, if you want to get a single user's grade, because you're creating a dashboard or even for proctoring services, let's just take that as an example, right? So as a single user, you're doing a proctoring client, you're creating a UI or something, or some service that needs to be used for that single user as they're working through the course, then this is a grant type that they'll want to use, because they want to then be able to make future calls to our APIs and stuff like that on behalf of a user. Or if they're using if you're using edX as an identity provider and you need to do single sign-on with some external service, then this is also the grant type that you want to use. Now, if you're making the calls like to get a report for grades or something like that, and if you want to call an API that will then asynchronously like provide a report for you and things like that, then this is probably the grant type that you'll want. So in terms of like changes to that, like that really, the biggest thing is that we want people to start using JOT as the access token type. So this is what we want people to migrate towards. But other than that, we don't expect, and like, unless if you yourself want to look inside the JOT to get data, then you can do that by using a JOT library, and it will automatically base64 decode it, and you can get data from it. But otherwise, it's all opaque to you because, or it can be, right? You do this flow, and then whatever access token you got, then in the next call for all your APIs, just pass that access token. Just have to make sure you put JOT in there in the authorization header. Does that answer your question, Peter?
That helps a lot, and makes it seem less scary.
Okay, good. Yeah, like I said, OAuth just does seem scary because there's all these different verbiage, and it does not do one single thing, it does many things. But in the end, it always comes down to this, of making a call with API, I believe, but like it has many different use cases, so. Any other questions out there? John, did you have any questions? Seemed like you did earlier.
I did, and so it was, you answered some of them, and some of them is just, there's a lot, I mean, I think, I know, I've got a lot to figure out, to learn about authentication. And so there's a lot to kind of figure out here, because one of the things that I'm looking into now is understanding better like resource object level permissions.
Yeah.
Like for one of the key things now that I'm working on, and I know that EduNext also works on, is multi-site stuff. I know EduNext also works on multi-site stuff. I believe that we're doing it a little bit differently, but this is where I'm like looking at, how can we, once we have a resource, let's say that, we're part of, you're getting resources for orgs, for example, and I want resources for one org, but I shouldn't get resources for another org or a set of users or whatever the collection happens to be.
Yeah.
And so then taking on, I know that this is a huge amount of work, and shifting from where we are now and then moving in and the microservices, breaking out friends, a huge mass amount of work. I'm interested in the roadmap of kind of getting into more granular authorization on data.
Yeah, so do you see this slide that I'm putting up?
Yep.
Yeah, so this was the last slide on my presentation, thinking if anyone brought this up. But so this is probably another talk. We can also talk about this on the Dev Summit because it's still sort of early stages, looking for input and all that. And here too, we need to distinguish between two things. The first bullet item is basically application. Oh shoot. Okay, let's call it client client level permissions.
Yep.
So the word we use client today, right? So the OAuth client. So the client that is trying to make calls on behalf of the user or that's making server calls, that client level permissions, we support that with OAuth scopes. And OAuth scopes is something that we've implemented recently, and it does have information about being able to embed organization related things in there as well. And then the API endpoints can make use of that. I did not go into that today. And then the remaining bullets on this slide are all around role-based access control and permissioning and things like that. The last bullet is captured in OAuth 9, which is more about like within an application or, and here when I mean application, I'm talking about the resource, right? The endpoint that's trying to enforce permissions. The fact that we should use Django permissions and make it declarative, trying to make it more aspect oriented, that's all captured in OAuth 9.
Okay, great.
And then all these other middle stuff, which is like, okay, do we support, what are those system-wide roles? And we want that to be configurable by Open edX instances. What are then the mapping between roles and users? Where is that stored? Can we include that in JOTs? Then the mapping between, one thing that we're thinking is that we want each application, each microservice, each feature to own its own roles, because it doesn't make sense to like have a centralized place for it that we need to then, it slows feature development down. And also by having application specific roles here or feature specific ones, right, it also allows for plugins and this whole vision that we have around extensibility. So, but still, we will probably want a way to map system-wide roles to these feature-specific ones. So, like, anyway, we could probably have another. We are at time now, but like, we probably have another session about just that. And this we have not yet started in terms of implementation. However, we have started in terms of discussions around this, at least within our current within our organization right now. So.
Thank you, Nimi.
Yeah, and I think this is where you're getting at. So yeah, it's a different topic and we should discuss that. Okay. So we're at time now. So thank you for all of you who have joined today. If you guys have any suggestions, we are currently scheduled on the calendar for 2 weeks for another Open edX architecture hangout. If there are no topics, then I might cancel it. But, or if we want, we could also use that as a session to brainstorm on Dev Summit topics, or we could dive a little bit deeper on authorization. So if you can post in Slack, if you have thoughts on what the agenda item is, that would be great, or on our wiki page, that would be great. Okay.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Manisha. Bye.
Thank you, Manisha. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.